decision making. Like,
Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce.
So let's talk about redlining. Redlining became illegal in the United States as early as 1968. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act was followed by the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act of 1970.
1968 is not that long ago. People seem to have these things where it's like, this was so... Like, the first black girl, the first black person to go to a non-segregated school, I think just turned like 68 years old, okay? Like, that's pretty insane. Okay, a lot of people have parents who are in the position they are because the grandparents, were college educated, grew up in wealthy neighborhoods. Like, I'm sorry, 65 years old. Yeah, like, these people are not, like, this was not, like, ancient history. People act like this is, like, yeah.
75, which was a predecessor to the Community Reinvestment Act, both of which were an attempt to ensure that people who are living in low-income minority neighborhoods could actually get loans. And these things were very effective. In 1992, researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston tried to look at the data. They collected information on some 30 variables related to lending decisions. They found that virtually all of the difference between minority and non-minority denial rates was explained by those variables. A reanalysis of that information found that black-owned banks were actually lending to white-owned businesses at higher rates than they were lending to black-owned businesses.
What's your current thoughts on this defund the police and abolition 8 thing? It seems to be gaining steam.
It's stupid. It's not gaining steam. It'll stop in a fucking couple weeks. No one cares. It's dumb. They're like, reforming the police is good. The idea behind abolishing or defunding the police is complicated and stupid, and people always have to re-explain everything. It's stupid messaging. Okay, you have to be really careful sometimes when you talk about, like, oh, well, actually, we did not, like, if I walk into a room and I hand out $100 to all the white kids, and I give $10 to all the black kids, and then I bring in an ice cream shop, and I say, well, I'm going to sell ice cream to everybody in here, and I'm going to charge $20 per ice cream. And then, we come at the end of the day to find out, like, oh, none of the black kids were able to get any of the ice cream. All the white kids got ice cream. And we were to do an analysis afterwards. And it's like, okay, well, we analyzed using 3 different independent methods to figure out, like, if the ice cream sellers were engaging in racial discrimination at all. And when we did the analysis, we actually found out, no, they actually weren't engaging in racial discrimination at all. All they were doing was selling to the people that could afford it. Like, it's kind of true, but it's also kind of sort of missing, like, the bigger picture, right? Like, it's not surprising that black banks are lending more to white people, or that white banks are lending more to white people because of economic reasons. I mean, like, we're literally just coming out of, like, segregation and shit. Like, yeah. Like, there's already been, like, a lot of economic harm committed amongst, like, African Americans. Like, it's not really that surprising that banks that only loan or only loan to wealthier people also tend to loan to white people, right? Like, yeah. Love you, Steven. Bonus meme, no bonus meme, bet shot. No, Dr. Jeezy. Nice job. Okay.
Furthermore, if it seemed that banks were discriminating against black borrowers on the basis of they needed to have higher credit qualifications, what you would see is lower default rates from black clients of banks, from people who are borrowing money from banks in the black community. There are 0 studies that show any of this. So the bottom line is this. Redlining was an evil and awful policy. It was made illegal in the 1960s. By the 1980s, the banks were not lending at disproportionate rates. In fact, if you look at among different communities, as Thomas Sowell has pointed out, Asian Americans get loans.
This is like, dog, this is like 15 years later, right? Like, we know that economic harms can ripple throughout generations. Like, this is known, right? Like, it's so funny that on one hand, you know, conservatives will say like, dude, this was 20 years ago, and then they will fucking fight you to death on things like an inheritance tax, right? You want to tax my fucking inheritance? That's for my fucking children, blah, blah, blah. And then on the other hand, they'll be like, okay, so what if your fucking grandpa was in a fucking all-black school? Come on, is it that big of a deal, dude? This was fucking 35 years ago, dog. Get over it. Like, holy shit, like, chill. Well, like, which is it? Like, does it matter what you leave onto your kids, or is it bullshit? Like,
more easily than white Americans. That does not mean the banks are being racist toward white Americans on behalf of Asian Americans. When it comes to college education, it is also worth noting that, yes, there were many universities that were segregated. There were many universities that did not allow black people to attend. Since the 1970s, the most prominent measure that has been used in order to admit black students to major universities across the country.
Focus.
Thank you.
Country has been affirmative action, which actively discriminates against people who are not black in favor of black applicants, specifically by ensuring that black applicants don't have to have the same test scores or GPAs in order to get into those same schools. So not only has policy been corrected, it's been overcorrected in these areas.
Kevin's grandparents.
My understanding, we should do like a stream, I need to put this in the back burner someday, where we look at like, my understanding is that just like affirmative action never works out like quite that simple. Like, I think the way that it worked in, I think the way that it worked in Harvard was that they basically have like all their normal admissions process, and then I think they have like an extra 200 students that they can accept for other reasons. Like, I don't even think this includes academic stuff. I think for whatever things, and then in those extra like qualifying things of that extra group of students, they would enact some affirmative action policies. I think was how it worked. But it wasn't just like, oh, like all of these white people and all of these Asians that otherwise would have made it like got fucked or whatever. Like that's not usually how it works.
On the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and get accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids.
The basic assumption of this video is that if your grandparents are rich in the United States, this means that you are rich in the United States. And that if your grandparents are poor in the United States, that means that you are poor in the United States.
Twitch chat, bitch
This
chat,
is factually untrue. The reality is that income changes over time, that there are an enormous number of people in the United States by percentage who are able to rise from poor to middle class and their children from middle class to wealthy. The biggest problem that we have in the United States right now is not a historic wealth gap. The biggest problem we have is an income gap in the United States. And there's some fascinating statistics surrounding this. There was a Harvard study recently that showed that black males who were growing up in the same household incomes as white males were actually underperforming their white male counterparts, even in high-income neighborhoods. You would think that all of this might imply racism, except for one inconvenient fact in the study. Black women who are growing up in the same high-income neighborhood.
Okay, this is not true. Well, it's kind of true. Like, people have been making gains, of course, but there is something in America. The concept is called stickiness at the ends, okay? The idea is that, Americans raised at the bottom and top of the family income ladder are likely to remain there as adults, a phenomenon known as stickiness at the ends. While a majority of Americans exceed their parents' family incomes, the extent of that increase is not always enough to move them to a different rung of the family income ladder. 43% of Americans raised in the bottom quintile, that's the bottom 20%, remain stuck in the bottom as adults, and 70% remain below the middle. 40% raised to the top quintile remain at the top as adults, and 63% remain above the middle. Only 4% of those raised in the bottom quintile make it all the way to the top as adults, confirming that the rags to riches story is more often found in Hollywood than in reality. Similarly, just 8% of those raised at the top quintile fall all the way to the bottom.
Wanted to get your input. What do you think about keeping or aborting a child fetus with Down syndrome? My wife is pregnant with our second child and are testing next week for it. BC, her family has history of DS great aunt. Thanks.
Dude, I can't make that decision for you. I don't even know why you would ask me. Like, wait, I'm curious I'm curious. I want to be in the room when they do is it an amniocentesis or whatever, where they poke in and check for Down syndrome, and the doctor's like, it looks like your kid's gonna have Downs. And then what are you gonna tell your wife? Like, hey, like, I was listening to this Twitch streamer, and he actually said we should abort our kids. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull the trigger on that option. Thanks, doc. Like, what? I can't give you advice on that. Jesus. Blacks have a harder time exceeding the family income and wealth of their parents than do whites. 66% of blacks raised in the second quintile surpass their parents' family income, compared with 89% of whites. Only 23% of blacks raised in the middle surpass their parents' family wealth, compared with over half of whites. Blacks are more likely to be stuck in the bottom and fall from the middle than are whites. I'm sorry, but like this is just a numbers game. When you bring in these weasel words, where it's like a large number of people increase their a ton of people, but it's like, okay, dude, like what do the numbers say? Like this is a numbers game, because this is what we're talking about. We're talking about all of society.
That showed that black males who were growing up in the same household incomes as white males were actually underperforming their white male counterparts, even in high-income neighborhoods. You would think that all of this might imply racism, except for one inconvenient fact in the study. Black women who are growing up in the same high-income neighborhoods as white women growing up in the same high-income neighborhoods, black women were performing at exactly the same or higher rates than white women in those neighborhoods, which would suggest that there are other factors at play other than simple racism. Furthermore, the basic idea that most wealth in the
Anytime somebody starts hitting you up with like very specific examples, you can almost bet your fucking life that this is cherry picked like a motherfucker. When somebody is comparing black women in high income neighborhoods to white women in high, I feel like we must be hardcore cherry picking there. What the fuck? But okay.
The United States is inherited, and that millionaires are really only millionaires because their parents were millionaires. That really isn't true either. The vast majority of millionaires and billionaires are people whose parents were not millionaires. And
no one cares about this. I saw someone in chat post this. Oh, Destiny, 8 out of 10 millionaires were their parents were. No one gives a fuck about millionaires. We're not talking about millionaires. Okay, we don't care about millionaires. We're talking about like average, like normal Americans. How can a normal person expect to be, right? And the normal person probably can't expect to make it to being a millionaire in an appreciable amount of time. Also, nobody gives a fuck if you're a millionaire at 80 years old. Congratulations, you've saved up for retirement your whole life, and now you have 1.2 million stashed away for your end of life retirement or whatever. No one cares. Okay.
Billionaires. Chris Hogan, who's a black financial expert, he did a survey of 10,000 people, and what he found was that of those 10,000 people, 74% of millennials believed millionaires inherited their money, 52% of baby boomers did, but only 21% of millionaires received any inheritance at all. Just 16% inherited more than $100,000. Only 3% received an inheritance at or above $1 million. In reality...
Wait, hold on. Oh, God, I'm sorry. He's just, like, rapid-fire shit. I don't understand. Hold on.
Millionaires inherited their money. 52% of baby boomers did. But only 21% of millionaires received any inheritance at all. Just 16% inherited more than $100,000. Only 3% received an inheritance at or above $1 million. In reality, the best path toward wealth in this country is income mobility, not inherited wealth.
This opened up...
Sure, that's true, but nobody... Well, maybe some people do. Nobody intelligent would ever say that, like, oh, the reason why all these people are millionaires is because they inherit all their money. Yeah, some dipshit fucking lefties and some dumb fuck progressives probably say that. But the reality is that being born into a wealthy family confers so many advantages in and of itself. Every dumb fuck in America was like, wow, Bill Gates' children have it so hard because he's going to give away 95% of his wealth, blah, blah, blah. Or, oh my God, Warren Buffett's children have it so hard because he's promised to give away 99% of his wealth. These motherfuckers don't have it hard. These guys are born with a silver spoon and a silver bowl and fucking golden sheets on their beds, okay? These people have awesome connections. They had great fucking schooling. They had amazing fucking parents. They probably excelled in all of their classes. They probably have business friends out the fucking ass. They probably have job connections, life connections, like business connections. They probably have like referrals and clients that they didn't even earn. That like there are so many things, there are so many advantages that you get in life by being born into a wealthy family. Like income or just like earning an inheritance. Who the fuck cares? That's like the least of what you need. Or, like getting an inheritance is like one of the most worthless things you could get as a kid. Like it's the growing up in that environment confer to you the massive set of advantages that wealthy children have. Not getting a big fucking windfall when your mom and dad kick the bucket.
up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances.
As it turns out, there are some complicating factors that don't get cited in this video with regard to
Let's hear
this
them.
data. The Federal Reserve Board economists tried to explain that this data did not take account of differences that were not income-based, things like liabilities, employment history, credit record, and other relevant variables that should have been considered. It should not be particularly surprising.
Again, segregation, okay? Till the 1960s was legal. Of course, income history and all this shit is gonna fucking vary. What the fuck? Like, yeah.
Surprising that discrimination in the past has impact on the actual income of people who are living in the areas that were denied loans. That shouldn't be a major surprise. But that is not the only disparity, obviously. That New York Times piece they are citing says, quote, they estimate the maps account for 15 to 30% of the overall gaps in segregation and home ownership that they find between the highest risk area and the second highest risk areas. Those were the ones that were being classified. The truth is that when it comes to redlining, you have to look at the gradations as well. There is always going to be a difference in the availability of loans to people who are living in the highest risk areas as opposed to the people who are in the very lowest risk areas. Another factor is that if history does make a difference, then if you are denied loans in a particular area, and if there's less money in those areas, and as crime goes up, and as property taxes kick in, there's not enough money to take, and as schools get worse, obviously that's going to continue to have effect in that particular area. That doesn't.
He's doing it. He's so close. You're describing the problem. Yes, you're doing it.
Doesn't mean the same people are living in that area who always lived in that area, or that people who grew up in that area in 1960 necessarily have to live in that area, or that their grandkids have to live in that area in 2020.
Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that.
No, stupid, okay? Don't get baited into this shit, okay? For my progressives out there, okay? Not my lefties. We don't fuck with lefties. All my homies hate lefties, okay? My progressives out there. The big deal with systemic or structural racism, okay? Please, I want to hear everybody repeating this fucking 2 years from now, and nobody can give me credit for it. I don't give a fuck, okay? The big thing about structural or systemic racism is that it works without any bad actors, is that it perpetuates itself without any individual hating black people explicitly or implicitly. This idea that you need all these people to be implicitly racist or whatever against somebody, and that if we can just fix that, these problems go away, it's not true. Like, these things require like bigger structural upheaval or bigger breakings of the cycle than just making people more aware of their implicit biases. All right, don't get baited into defending this. This is a stupid point, and Ben's probably going to argue against it.
They have.
One of the big problems with implicit bias, it is very, very difficult to quantify, identify, and studies that supposedly determine that your implicit bias results in real-world action are deeply flawed. Implicit bias assessment tests, for example, are so significantly flawed they are virtually unusable.
Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names.
The research is actually a lot more interesting than what is being portrayed
It's
in
not.
this video. There are several studies here. There was one famous study that was done that suggested that first name differentiation was indeed being used by employers. So if your name was Lakeisha, for example, this is the name that is actually used in the study. Lakeisha versus Greg. that you are less likely to get a callback. There was another study that showed a historically black last name like Washington or Jefferson provided no actual differentiation from historically white names, like Greenberg, for example. So if your name was Steve Greenberg versus Steve Jefferson, you're just as likely to get a callback as Steve Jefferson. What that suggests, and this was confirmed by subsequent studies, is that
it's on income?
The actual issue here is a question of class discrimination, not an issue of race discrimination. In other words,
how do you Okay, first of all, thank you, Ben. I will give Ben mad fucking props for accurately citing that second study, because people will bring it up all the time. People will say, well, actually, we've revisited that one study about the racist last names, or about the racist people, like, interpreting things based on names, and actually, that's not true anymore. People don't discriminate based on names. But if you actually go in and read the methodology of that study, the names that they use are like what he just said. The black name will be like Stephen Jefferson, or like David Washington or whatever. Like, oh, like Stephen and David. Those aren't black names, right? Like, yeah, like I don't think people would or this might be my sheltered white experience. It's possible I could be wrong, but my understanding is that I don't think most people would read a name like Stephen Jefferson and instantly see like, oh, a black guy, like they would like Jamal or something, or Tyrone or whatever. But when Ben is about to go on here and say like, well, the problem is that we were discriminating against class, not race, and you go, well, how did you figure out their class, Ben? And you go, well, I mean, her name is fucking Lakeisha. What do you mean, dude? Like, okay, dog, like how many white chicks do you know with the name Lakeisha? Yeah, especially when you're talking about like last name Washington and Jefferson. Like I'm thinking of fucking U.S. presidents, like not like the Jeffersons from Nick at Night.